Hi, I'm Brendan Malone and you're watching Left Foot Media. Today's program is a discussion that I had with Kelechi Osunwa. Kelechi is a self-described left-leaning black guy, and we decided that what better topic for a white guy and a black guy to talk about than race relations. We tried to cover as many different issues as we could. We talked about Black Lives Matter, we talked about microaggressions. You name it, we've tried to jam it into this conversation. Hopefully you find it really interesting. Just a little technical note before you get started. Partway through our conversation, Kelechi's computer completely crashed, and so he had to start using his iPhone instead. So if you're watching this particular episode and partway through, you notice there's a big change in the image that you're looking at, and things look quite a bit different. That's why that has happened. So don't panic, it's not you, it's us and our technical problems. So without any further ado, I present to you Kelechi and Brendan talking about race relations. Enjoy. Kelechi, thanks for being with us here today and agreeing to host this discussion between what I would describe myself as being a typical white guy and you described yourself to me as a left-leaning black guy. Let's get right into it. I want to start by talking about, before we talk about Black Lives Matter and some of the race relations issues, because we're going to try and cover some pretty big, deep topics today.
Yeah.
I want to start by talking about this, the shifting of left-wing politics. Just a little bit about me. I grew up in a working-class home, which eventually became a welfare home because my father experienced serious illness that caused him to lose his job. And so when I first started voting 22 years ago, I was a left-wing voter because the left was very much all about the working class. It was about genuine social justice. But it seems to me that in the last 10 years or so, the left has now been consumed by identity politics, by progressive politics, and it seems less interested in those causes and more interested in some of the stuff that's just a bit out there on the fringe. And I want to start by one of those things that frustrates the heck out of me, and I want to hear your take on this, is what do you think about microaggressions? Because this whole term microaggressions is thrown around now all over the place. To me, I don't think they exist. I think you're either being a jerk or you just don't know a certain key bit of information, and so you ask those typical grandma questions. So you see someone who looks Indian and you say, what part of India do you come from? And it turns out they're Sri Lankan. To me, that's not an act of aggression or racism. That's just the fact that you don't know enough because you haven't travelled enough, and you have those sort of conversations and all of a sudden you find out that new information and you don't make that mistake again. I don't see why this is being treated as an aggression or an act of racism. What are your thoughts?
Okay, Bill, before I even look, first and foremost, thank you very much for having me come on and discuss it. I think it's really, really good that we get a chance to speak about these things and have a discussion, because very easily it can be a yelling contest and get into a debate, and that doesn't really help or resolve anything. In terms of the microaggression part, I find that very, very interesting because, like, as I said to you earlier, like, my blackness is a little different, right? Like, I'm a Nigerian who grew up in New Zealand. Like, I grew up in a community, or basically a community in Mount Albert, which was very, very multicultural. I had the Samoan boys, I had the Tongan boys, I had, a whole group of South Sudanese and Somalians growing up. So I had a very, very cool way of, like, growing up with people from a working class background. At the same time, I ended up going to Maclean's College on the east side of Auckland. So that was pretty, like, completely different spectrum of things, right? Yeah. So for me, like, I don't necessarily see a lot of microaggressions, and that's just because I just don't see it. Because again, a bit like you, I can sometimes not be aware of that stuff, right? But let's put it this way. If you are a black lady, right, who gets her hair touched almost every week by somebody who's just like, your hair is lovely, it's fantastic, why is it so curly? Like, I can deal with that because it might happen to me once every 3 months, and a lot of the times it's my, like, 6-year-old kids who in my sports class, whereas if it's a grown adult who's doing it, by the 20th time I might snap. You know what I mean? I might have a situation, an incident where, and just like you generally said, it may not be their fault. It comes from a place of complete ignorance, and ignorance is absolutely fine. Like, it's just a case of not understanding and not knowing. But then again, like, we need to sit there and look at that perspective of that person who it's the 20th time it's happened, and for some reason they just go off. And I think we don't have a lot of understanding in that regard. So, like, the case I'm going to use here is the incident of Ellen, who had the picture of Usain Bolt, and she was riding Usain Bolt, and, like, I kind of sort of, I was like, hey, this is kind of funny. But then some people who, with a heightened history, with a heightened sense, who can actually date back and look back and see their family or family members who had people actually literally ride other black people, can sit there and be like, yo, this is not on. And so that's where I kind of see it kind of gets confounded where, as you were saying, in terms of that identity politics that comes through where people can see microaggressions. I personally think, and I'm learning about this, right? Because as I said, I've been very, very left-leaning myself. And I personally think since kind of understanding more from the right-hand side or from the centrist point of view, I personally think that like, that is going to get you bogged down arguing the wrong things. Like, that's going to get you bogged down arguing things that aren't quite as important as, for example, institutional racism, like, which is something I think we should actually all look into rather than, you know, the microaggressions that happen. But again, like I said, if it's the 20th time that happens to somebody, no doubt they're going to like snap.
Yeah, see, I look at that situation because I've heard that example before as well, people touching other people's hair. I've never understood that because that's not what I do to people, anyone. It's just weird. Even if I admire a particular hairstyle like an afro, I don't think, oh, I've got to touch that. It's kind of weird to me. And so to me, I look at that and I think that person's just being a jerk, you know, rather than necessarily any, I don't know, the assume, it seems to me people are assuming this is a racist action, not just a jerk action. And to me, and same, so with that thing with Ellen, I saw that tweet that she put out and I thought, I just didn't think it was that funny. But at the same time, I didn't look at it and think, okay, she's deliberately trying to be racist here. Because, see, for there to actually be aggression, I think there has to be some sort of deliberate intent. I think you have to know and to mean, yeah, I'm actually going to make an offensive joke based along the lines of race. And it just, to me, that doesn't appear that that's what she was doing at all.
When I saw that joke, I instantly was just like, I didn't really see the hilariousness there. I suppose the other point of view there is that ignorance coming from a place of wanton and willful ignorance? Is that ignorance coming from a place where a person hasn't even thought about the other person or how the other person might feel or thought about the history or the context around it? For example, just last week, they had a case of blackfacing here in Australia where a mother dressed up their child to mimic Nat Nui, a big AFL star here in WA, painted the entire kid black. And I'm sitting there going like, look, there's a massive history of these things. Nat Nui comes out and says, look, I can see where the admiration comes from, but we need to understand that there's a history there. Now, that mum knew about that history and still did it anyway and was just like, screw you, I don't care about the haters, like, do what you want to do. And so there we can sit there and be like, it's actually gone past ignorance. And like you said, it's gone into being a jerk. Now we need to sit there and say, is that case of being a jerk willfully not knowing? Is it coming from a place of genuine ignorance and just not knowing? Because I don't like to think people are jerks. I don't think people like naturally are jerks. I like to believe that people are more naturally inquisitive and naturally curious to actually get an idea of what these things are. But yeah, so I can sit there and be like, yo, it's one of those catch-22s where I personally, like, I, for example, could not care about blackface, but it's happened 6 times in Australia this year. And it's like, when will people learn? And so I suppose like the 7th time it happens, I might flip out.
Yeah, I think I think about that example because I see that there is an Aboriginal mother who painted her child white. It's in the news today over here as a reaction to that. And I actually thought that was kind of a clever way of highlighting it. But the whole thing to me seems a little bit like, to me, it's quirky. I've got 5 kids. I wouldn't do that to any of them, even if I admired, say, I don't know, John Olomu, who's dead now. But let's say, you know, my kids, I was really into Jonah, and I wanted to send one of my kids along dressed up like Jonah. I just wouldn't paint them in blackface because it's just quirky and weird. But to me, it's like, why do we jump to the conclusion that the person is being a racist? Because to me, that's quite another. This is jerk. This is racism. You know, that's quite a serious violation. At the same time, I can also understand people who say, well, why do we have to be the constant butt of every one of your jokes?
That's 100% right. Like, I think that massive jump between ignorance and just being a jerk and being a racist is huge. And like, it's very hard to come back from being labeled a racist, right? It's easy to come back from being labeled a jerk. Again, I keep trying to go back to this like wanton, willful ignorance, Like, I turned up to a party once and the person wanted to dress up as Tiger Woods and he turned up in blackface. And I stood there and I was like, dude, what's your beef? Like, what do you not understand about this thing? And everybody there said to me, look, it wouldn't have been so bad if you weren't there. And so, like, they clearly aren't all racist, right? They clearly aren't all racist. It's just they don't understand the stigma. They just don't understand what's going on there in terms of how someone would actually feel where. And the very, very funny thing about this is the vast majority of people who are like, I don't see color, I just see people, I just see human beings. They're the ones who are putting their kids in blackface. And that's where it's a little problematic.
Tell me then, let's talk about this blackface issue then. Just, it wasn't the topic of our discussion today, but I think it's worth exploring for, for all the typical whiteys out there who might be going, well, what is the big deal? From your perspective, what is it that when you look at, say, blackface, so you personally say it's not that big a deal for you, but and let's talk about in more general terms, people who are non-white ethnicity, when they see blackface, what is it about that for them? That what does it bring up? What is the insult? What is the offence that they see in that?
Like, it's you go back to the minstrel shows where back in the day, black people weren't actually seen as good enough to be actors or actresses. And so they'd have white people play them. But a lot of the times the roles that they were playing were just like awful, like visceral stereotypes of black people being lazy and being dumb and being really, really slow and things like that. And it actually happens like today where and this goes deep into like just skin issue and colorism, where people aren't seen with like the blackness isn't seen as an aesthetic good, right? And you can even look into Asian societies where people are trying to make themselves lighter. They're lightening cream hair for Indian people, for black people, for and I said Indian people like an asshole. I mean, like,
that's one microaggression point off for you.
Right. And so, like, you can see how people sit there and say, historically, we have never been deemed good enough to actually play in our roles. And that actually happened not too long ago in the case of Zoe Saldana. She played Nina Simone. Now, Nina Simone is a very dark, powerful, strong woman, and her dark skin color was something that she accentuated. And she gets played by Zoe Saldana, who's a light-skinned woman, and they actually literally painted her darker so she could play that role. And people are sitting there going, well, why couldn't you just literally find another dark-skinned woman to play that role? Because dark-skinned women don't get jobs or opportunities, just like back in the day for these minstrel shows. So you can see how we keep having it come up, and it's like, this is actually really, really offensive. But at the same time, and this is where cultural context and precedent takes place. Last year, it happened in Germany where two black players were attacked by right-wing neo-Nazis, basically. So the entire team painted themselves black to say, we're all cool, we're all fine with it. And that's the funny thing there is, like, in an African society which hasn't had the exposure to the American, well, basically to the American history of the minstrel shows, that was fine. That was absolutely fine for those black players. It was absolutely fine for that German team because they just don't have that history and understanding and context. Now, it happened for an amateur league club, right? But if it happened for a professional league club, they'd have a better idea of the history, the social, the context, and they would have chosen a different way to show solidarity with their teammates. So a lot of it comes from, if you don't know and you do it, I've got no problem with it. If you do know and you still do it and you get called out on it and you're like, well, actually, you're being the one who's been PC gone mad, that's a little problematic there.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think about it from my perspective. I can only think about it, right, from a Kiwi, European, Irish descent white guy. And so if I saw someone who was black who had painted themselves white to play a black character, say at a fancy dress party, it wouldn't bother me. But then in saying that, there's no history of people painting themselves white as an act of to make black people inferior or to treat them in that way, and so and obviously that's possibly part of the factor here that that just changes everything. Tell me, let's talk about while we're on this topic, and we'll just go a bit sideways. I want to talk about reparations. One of the things we're starting to hear a bit more. I want to talk about Black Lives Matter separately. But one of the things we're starting to hear is that more of these calls for reparations now, and even out of America, there are people cropping up and movements cropping up that are starting to say, well, because of slavery, we should be given money. Now, here in New Zealand, as you know, the Māori people lost land, they had land unjustly taken from them, and so the government engaged in what were known as treaty settlements to actually make reparation for the unjust taking of land. To me, that's clear. The boundaries are clear. It makes sense. But when you talk about something like slavery that happened hundreds of years ago to your ancestors, I can't see how you can put a objective boundary on that. Because if you start saying that, so you say, well, you white guys in America, you enslaved our ancestors, so you owe us money. then what about the slavery that happened between African tribes? Does that mean that you could then say, well, we're not going to take a claim, one group of people from Africa take a claim against another group of people from Africa saying, because your tribe used to do this to us. Where do you stop that? Because it doesn't seem it's got anything other than an arbitrary boundary on it at that point.
It's funny you mentioned that. I'll give you two examples, right? So my last name is Osunwa, and that literally Osupa means slave, and Nwa means son, right? So the long context, or the short context is son of slave. The long context is fed by the sons of slaves. So essentially my tribe and my last name had slaves. The difference there, I suppose, is one, like the rights for the slaves were vastly different to the rights of the slaves that happened in America, in terms of they were allowed to marry, they were allowed to join the other classes, they would basically serve for 7 years and then be given what was theirs, right? And I suppose that's one of the very, very things that kind of get lost in that like Christian idea of like serve for 7 years. You think about, was it Isaac and Jacob? Serve for 7 years and then I'll give you your, what I owe you. I think, and this is what's actually coming in the new wave of it is, and you can look at Ta-Nehisi Coates, who writes a case for reparations in The Atlantic, as well as Sandy Darity. They speak about that as well, but they speak about it from 1920 moving forward. And they speak of it from 1920 moving forward because they literally point out instances and situations where the state moves forward and oppresses black people, where the state comes through with laws that oppress black people from getting into housing, where they put redlining in to make sure that black people live in a certain area, when then that certain area removes jobs and schooling and education and funding from that certain area. And so their case comes back and says, look, it's from the 90s. And if you look at any scholar who actually speaks and thinks about reparations, the case isn't, is reparations right or wrong? The case isn't, should it happen? The case tends to be, can we financially pay it? And if that's the case, then it's not a moral issue. It's a financial issue. And then we need to do some introspective thinking there, whether it's a, how do we get to sort it out, rather than, is this right or wrong?
See, the thing for me is I think there is a moral question, because I think about the eugenics that black people in America were subjected to. And this is before Hitler was even in politics. This was happening in America. Forced sterilizations, experimentation after World War II even, when everyone knew about the full horrors of Nazi eugenics. You have black communities in places like Louisiana who are being denied medicine for sexually transmitted infections because they wanted to test the effectiveness, right? Which is absolutely outrageous. Now, there are people still alive who were the victims of that. And there are states, I read an article just last year, that are still refusing to compensate the people who are actually victims of that sort of stuff. Now, to me, that's sort of clear, and that to me, that makes a lot of sense. I just think there's some of these, and maybe they are just lone wolf lunatics who are now starting to crop up that you're seeing a bit more of in the last couple of months, saying, well, we should have money, or we should have your money because of what you've done to us or did to our ancestors,
I suppose I need to check myself and make sure people understand that I am a Nigerian New Zealander who lives in Australia. So I don't have that political, historical, intergenerational history that black people there have. And like, we can get into a deeper topic and issue in terms of what is blackness, right? And so I think if you sit there and make those cases based simply on the economic value, based on things that happen after separate but equal, after Browns versus Topeka, you can sit there and say, well, look, like, these are the cases of people who should actually get reparations based on what the government, what the state have done. I personally, I find it very, very hard to go all the way back into slavery and sit there and decide who gets what, because a lot of times, and I suppose the beauty of America, and I suppose Australia and New Zealand, is it's a very migrant story. It's migrants who have come in, who have done a lot of good work, who have helped themselves out, who have started a community, who have uplifted themselves and then gone forward, you know what I mean? And then even going further into that, just looking at Harlem, for example, at one stage it was all Germans and they were persecuted. And one stage it was all Jews and they were persecuted. One stage it was Italians and they were persecuted. So we're going to give reparations to those sets of people as well for the laws that came through that way. So I think it's a very, very big convoluted thing, but people, please go out there, read Coates' case reparations in The Atlantic, but then also go further and read into Sandy Darity, and not just leftist African Americans, but also lead Glenn Lowry as well. Like the case is there, and a lot of the times it isn't whether it should happen or not, it's how do we pay for it, and I think that's telling in itself.
Before we look at the issue of Black Lives Matter and open up that big old can of worms, I think it's important too, because it just seems to me one thing, you know how sometimes pendulums swing? and historically the pendulum tends to swing. And I think we're in a phase where the pendulum, in some ways, on this issue, and I think about what is colloquially known as the social justice warrior movement, has swung too far in the other direction now, and it needs to come back a bit. Because I think turning every white person into part of an oppressor class, even if they don't intend to oppress, they aren't doing anything oppressive just by virtue of their whiteness, to me is really problematic. To me, it's engaging in surely the same sort of racial generalization, put down, derogatory approach to another race that our own race, or my own race, has been perhaps guilty of in the past, and I think, so the danger to me is we forget things like, there's no doubt that white people, particularly Europeans and then obviously in America, they owned and they ran an industry of slavery. But we forget that it's white people who also bring about an end to that. And we also forget that slavery was such a institutional problem for humanity, regardless of race, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, And so my concern is sometimes the pendulum, I think, is swinging too far in the other direction.
Yeah, I can see where that comes from, and I can completely agree. And I likened it to a time where, and this was just through my own lack of understanding. I had a friend who came out one day, and I was trying to learn more about like issues regarding feminism. I was just really, really curious about it. And she came out and was just like, "Your very existence is oppressing me." And I was like, "Whoa." I was like, "Whoa, like, what have I done?" And I actually like blocked and deleted her, and I didn't want anything to do with her. And then years later, I got to understand more where she was coming from, got to understand the exact amount of pain that she had been going through at that time. And she later came back and apologized and said that, look, it clearly wasn't like that, right? And you're right, sometimes that pendulum does swing from one way all the way to the other. I suppose what both sides need to do more, and this is like where I kind of love and hate President Obama, is he peddles hope so well. He peddles that middle ground so very well that it dispels anger, and anger is visceral. Anger gets stuff done. Like, you know what I mean? Like, anger gets stuff done. Hope is slow, and hope is like, yeah, hope is what we absolutely need. Like, believe me, hope is what we absolutely need, but it's just really, really slow. So I completely agree that in some situations and instances, like, we can have people sitting there being like, you need to check your white privilege. And look, sometimes I agree that some people need to check their white privilege. Like, sometimes I'm like, you need to really sit here and think about how good it is to be white. But at the same time, I do think that we get taken aback from it and realize that life is just tough. Like, life really, really is just tough for everybody as well.
Well, I think too, from my perspective, I really don't like the term privilege, whoever's using it in whatever context. To me, I think what's happened is a lot of people have just bought into, without very much thought and not even necessarily realising they've done it, they've bought into a very Marxist view of the world and of history. And what they've done is they've just substituted, gender or race or whatever in place of class struggle. And they've got an oppressor class and an oppressed class. And normally we like to be in the oppressed class. We don't like it, but because it's certainly no one wants to be the oppressor. And the thing I think now is people throw that term privilege around, though, as almost like certain people, say 10 years ago, were throwing the term politically correct around. They didn't really have a logical reason for doing it. It sort of became this thing that you would say to people when you didn't really want to actually try and argue down rationally about what the exact issue is and why you thought it was logically flawed or not,
Yeah, and I can see how people who don't have a complete argument, or people who don't have a complete point, can just label that and say, you just have privilege. You need to check your privilege, without actually sitting there and drilling down into what makes a person have privilege or have fortune, right? Like, I tell a story of how I grew up, again, in like crappy Mount Roskill, so crappy that John Key came out and said that the street that I lived on was a dead-end street. It's McGeehan Close. You can check that out. He said that the street that I lived on was a dead-end street. And I realized that in there, I still had some fortune or opportunity or luck that other people didn't have, right? I understood that there were these things that were there for me in terms of going out there and playing sport and being around positive role models and positive figures while my mum and dad were working hard all the time. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't have privilege. Right? That doesn't mean that I don't have certain structures or certain things that are keeping me afloat that I don't have to sit there and worry about. I suppose I personally don't have a problem with people using privilege if they're going to drill down and actually point in and narrow down into what that person has that is privileged about their lives, rather than just sit there and go, you're white, you get let off for things easy. And I've been called out on this in a very, very, the easiest case is the Stanford rapist, right? Bob Turner. I sat there and I was like, this is classic case of good to be white. This is classic case of like good to be white, good to be rich. And then it turns out that, you know what? Probably a poor, rich white kid from 8 Mile doesn't get that same kind of opportunity or justice, literally. And so as much as he would probably profit more from being black than being white than being black, but at the same time, a white person in that situation who doesn't have that same amount of money probably goes through and has a worse punishment than Brock Turner.
Yeah, and see, that's the thing. I think that's where you exactly, for me, hitting on the nuance. So I said I grew up working class and then welfare class. There were times we didn't know where the next meal was coming from. And people now look at me and assume, because I'm married, I've got 5 kids, and I own my own home, that, somehow, and you appear to dress okay, so maybe, you're privileged. Well, I just, that's not my experience. And I think the other thing, too, I think about the whole privilege concept is that we know now from neuroscience that one of the things, if your life is in a bad place and you need to start improving and getting out of that dark place or that bad place, a lot of it actually starts in the mind. And how you think of yourself, how you think of opportunity, and how you think of your situation and the people around you. But it seems to me that the whole privilege, oppressor class thing, what it does is it keeps people who genuinely believe they are being oppressed in some way stuck in a cycle of oppression, because they constantly view themselves as being oppressed. They constantly see everyone else or certain other groups of people oppressing them. And I just don't see how there's a positive way out of that sort of cycle if that's your view of history, of the world, of other people around you.
Can we use this and touch up on it later on? Because this is actually a point that I want to make, where we sit there and speak about how, like, there's this perception that African Americans in certain parts of society are just happy sitting there and blaming the white man for all the issues and fails, and how, like, hip hop and the culture actually doesn't, like, tell people to get up there. It kind of glamorizes the ghetto, when there are so many instances in hip hop and in subculture that have people saying, look, get up, stand up, get up, stand up for your rights. There's instances from Jay-Z, from like Kanye West, from rappers, just mainstream rappers who are basically sitting here saying, look, we don't want you to sell drugs because we did that and we want you to do more and do better. So there is this perceived notion that people kind of just want to be entrenched in there and feel sorry for themselves. And honestly, man, I'm sure, like you, just like yourself as a person who grew up in a working class background, know that people want the best for themselves. People want to work hard. People do not want handouts. People want to actually get out there and do stuff for themselves. And some people might need a bit of a hand. And once they get that hand, they're actually out there thriving and flourishing. But I think that we should touch up on this a bit later on as well.
Well, let's touch on that now, because I think this is interesting, because I watched a documentary recently, Poverty Inc., really good doco about particularly the economies in places like Africa and Haiti and other places that traditionally you would say, oh yeah, they're poor, they got kids with flies on them, quick, send them shoes, send them stuff. And it's this documentary's basically, most of it's interviews with people from those parts of the world who are entrepreneurs, who are businessmen and women, and who are saying, you've got to stop treating us like this. We are not this messed up culture that you think we are. You are actually destroying our thriving economies by coming here and throwing container loads of free shoes. The guy who's a cobbler, you've destroyed his business. Yeah, there was another one with, they were giving away free eggs. And they destroyed the local chicken farmers industry by doing that, and they're saying, stop treating us like we are impoverished people, incapable of actually doing these things, because we've got our own thriving economies, but you're destroying them with this stereotype mentality you have of people in Africa and Asia and other places where you think poverty is happening.
It goes even further. Like there's an example of Liberia and Nigeria in particular, when people were saying, we need to send aid because of whatever, like, was it Ebola, I think, at the time. And people are sitting there saying, no, you don't need to send us aid. You don't need to stop treating us as if we're second class citizens. What you need to do is make sure that governments and government institutions that you have here, that all your companies are paying taxes back into our economy. And once you start paying taxes back into our economy and not taking the tax that you owe us, taking it to Ireland, for example, where the tax laws are even cheaper, we can actually start doing stuff in our economy. And if that's the case, and sometimes that's not the case, sometimes you've got corrupt officials who are preventing that from happening. But if that's the case, if we can give us that opportunity to get rid of those corrupt officials who were there, then we can start having that money ciphered down. But if you don't even give us opportunity to get rid of corrupt officials because money's going elsewhere, it's hard to actually live and breathe on our own 2 feet. So these issues are very interrelated and prevailing, where donating to somebody I find that really funny where all intentions are good, turn out to be the complete wrong thing there as well.
Well, and it's almost like they say in this documentary, and it's absolutely spot on. It's like, respect our dignity. Don't think we're thick, simpletons from Africa who don't know how to run a complex economy and run a business.
That's the white man's burden. Like, that's the white man's burden. We're just savages who just don't understand stuff, and like we just need everybody's hand to help us out.
Oh yeah, it's terrible because their big complaint was, we just want you to trade with us. And if you trade with us, so what they did in Haiti was unbelievable. So under Bill Clinton, they had the whole rice thing, and they were giving supplements to local rice companies in America, subsidies to them to ship off excess product and give it away free in Haiti. They destroyed the rice farming industry. What that meant was there was no rice farming work for people, so they had to move into shanties closer to the capital city. And then when that big earthquake hit a couple of years ago, those shanty towns were an absolute disaster and lots of people got killed. Let's talk about Black Lives Matter. That's what we're going to talk about today. So let's get on to that in the time we've got left. Here's my take. Let's start at the beginning. My question is this, and I really wonder about this, whether or not this really truly is a police racism issue, or whether or not what we're actually seeing here is a militarization of the police and a police brutality issue. So the American police force now, in a lot of cases, the training is just so divergent. There's no universal standard from state to state. And there's a lot of militarization. Guys who are turning up with full assault rifles for urban policing and tanks and all sorts of stuff. And if you go into it with that mentality and your first reaction is pull the gun out on every police stop, surely that's going to create these sort of problems. I'm not necessarily convinced when I look at the data, when I look at the evidence, that this is a group of cops who are going, yeah, I'm going to shoot me a black man today. To me, it seems more like these guys are like, no, it's us versus them and we've got to kill them or they're going to kill us. And so it's a war,
The more I sit there and the more I think about it, the more I kind of realize that racism does play a part. And that's irrefutable in terms of the findings of the Department of Justice for Ferguson, for Baltimore, and even in the findings of New York City, right? For example, they found that in 2013, just looking at the stop and frisk search, in 2013, they found 104,000 instances of black people being innocent in 2013 alone. Now that number is more than the numbers were for 2013, 2014, 2015 of whites who were innocent and Hispanics who are innocent. So that's basically saying that they disproportionately targeted blacks to find that amount of innocent blacks for 1 year, the same that they found for whites and Latinos for 3 years. And so the next question there is, why don't they target those people more to find more drugs, basically, or more contraband? The other thing there is, in terms of that police brutality, it very, very much is a case of situations where the police are trigger happy. The police do have not the greatest training there. And I suppose one that we don't actually think about is that police have been called in to handle cases of drug use. Police have been called in to handle cases of domestic, not necessarily domestic violence, but they've been called in to handle instances of mental health. And they're basically increasing the chances in situations where police who already aren't trained efficiently enough can actually have to pull out a gun. I was speaking about a documentary which was showing the different tactics in policing in America as opposed to the UK, as opposed to what was the other place? Australia as well. And so you have all these instances and situations where they're playing videos and asking the police how they would deal. And a lot of the cases, the American police said, well, we just shoot them. Like, our lives are in danger. We just shoot them. And they showed a situation with 2 British police officers, unarmed, disarming a person with a knife. And the American police were shocked. They were just like, dude, your life is in danger. Why didn't you shoot him? And so if that's the training that happens, Colin Kaepernick's come out and said that police only need 6 months training before they can actually use a gun and commit state-sanctioned murder. And we understand policing is dangerous. That's why you have a gun. But surely there's a way we can have police learn a lot better ways to actually not kill people, to the point where we have police who are being turned down because they have too high IQ scores. Yeah, your IQ is too much to police.
You're absolutely right. And I think, to me, that's where I raise these questions about, is this the real issue here? And this us and them mentality that's cropped up combined with that. And the reason I say that is because I can't help but sense that, so one of the things I wonder about the Black Lives Matter messaging and protesting and everything else is, whether or not it's distracted away from some of the bigger questions that are actually at stake here. And so you talked before about the fact that the various studies that have shown there's a higher incidence for black people of being fined or pulled over or whatever the case is than, say, other ethnicities. However, when you dig down into that data often, you also find that the black community is represented much higher in the crime statistics. Yeah, now the question I have, though, is this, like I said, is this because they're being profiled and it's racist, or is this because there are serious issues within those communities like fatherlessness, poverty, and other things that actually really do need to be addressed and are not being addressed, and instead this becomes like a very easy lightning rod to... Now, I'm not saying there aren't racist incidents, because there's no doubt there are racist incidents that have happened, and all those other things matter as well, cops with bad training, but I can't help but sense we're distracting away from some pretty big systemic social problems that need to be addressed within those communities, and I mean by all of us.
That's a lot of things to unpack there. But let me finish off with one other thing that I was saying there, and I was saying that police are killing white people. There's a piece by John McVoyer. Look it up. It's from Time, and it basically shows all the instances this year and the last 2 years where police are killing white people, and the similarities between the cases of black individuals there. The difference is, and I suppose it's what Black Lives Matter are talking about, is when these things happen, a lot of chances and a lot of times the police officers are being charged with second degree and first degree murder. Whereas when it happens with black people, we are having situations where people are going above and beyond their means to actually kind of defend it. So there's a story of Alton Sterling, who was killed trying to reach for his gun. There are also stories of the next week and a white individual from Raleigh, North Carolina, called Billy Ray, who pulled out a gun at a police officer, tried to shoot him, was disarmed, pulled out another gun, tried to shoot him, and he was taken alive. Now, when we speak about fatherlessness there, that's a very, very interesting one, and that's one that Bill O'Reilly loves to just throw at us from Fox News, right? And I think fatherlessness there is an issue, but like let's be real here. It's, you can have a dad who's a terrible dad, you know what I mean? You can have a father who's absolutely awful, and the stats that you will see there is that 72% of African Americans grew up in was a single parent home or out of wedlock. But then what are the divorce rates? Like, what are the divorce rates there in those situations where people actually married and then come out and not have those children, or situations where people are born in a single parent housing and then they end up getting married after that? I suppose what all these things kind of point to, and this is what Black Lives Matter probably aren't doing the best job letting people know about, is that there's institutional things that are in there that make these things happen. And that's where I sit there and say, micro speaking, it is bad policing. It is incidences of being trigger happy. There are these things, but then you can sit there and say, what makes a person want to create more crime at a disproportionate rate than other people? Unless we're going to literally sit here and assume that black people are more inherently dangerous than anybody else. Because if that's the case, Africa wouldn't be in existence right now. Like, we would have wiped each other out there. And so this is where I think we need to actually sit there and think about. So whether it's the fatherlessness, and another one is that pride in that culture, right? That pride in that gangbanging. And this was something that Glenn Lowry was trying to speak about. And Glenn Lowry is a very conservative black writer and political commentator. And he says that people do have choices and people aren't taking and making the best use of those choices. And it's really funny because, like, in pop culture, in Tupac, where he speaks about changes, he talks, we need to make some changes. We need to see me as a brother instead of two distant strangers. Kendrick Lamar speaks about how he's jealous of a basketball player who's about to make it out the ghetto. And while the basketball player is sitting there in math class, he's out there drinking a 40 ounce. But he says that he wasn't jealous at him because, like, he had the talent. He was jealous because the statistics are showing that he probably has a better chance than he does. And so we can sit there and say that in this situation, what is expected to happen? Like, what do people expect to happen? If you're sitting there expecting low crime in a place where teachers are literally having to fund the schooling of the school out of their own pocket, where there are no jobs, where housing is tough. And I suppose the other really good one you pointed out was ghetto abandonment, because back in the 1920s, the black community was stronger, and that's because it had those intellectuals still in the ghetto. It had the intellectuals still in the hood, and as soon as they could get a chance, they left. And a lot of them didn't come back. But then, like, why put the onus on them to come back in there and do the work there?
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned the 1920s, because I read an article recently, the statistics for marriage rates in the black community in America in the 1920s, they were actually slightly higher than they were in the white community. You were more likely to live without your dad in a white family than you were in a black family. Now, it's like you say, one study I saw as high as 80%. It's what's happened, and that's because the simple fact is we know from the research, this is one of my specialty areas, if you take a white family and you put a white kid in a home without a dad, he's going to have to overcome a whole lot of stuff. And then when you add poverty into that mix as well, he's going to have to overcome a whole lot more stuff. He's far more likely to end up in a situation, when you talk about crime or just a life that doesn't pan out the way, a person can really flourish and experience the fullness of the human experience, I want to talk about two things before we finish. One is the Black Lives Matter tactics. What do you think? Because from where I'm sitting, this is actually stoking a fire that I don't know if it seems they're pouring petrol on rather than water.
It's very interesting because I sit there and I see situations where you've got people who are in the name of Black Lives Matter chanting "kill all cops," right? And I see situations where people get absolutely annoyed that a bridge is being blocked out and they can't get to work. And I suppose the point of a protest is to make people uncomfortable. The point of a protest is to sit there and have people take sides, whether they're right it or for it or against it. The other thing there is unfortunately, because of the way Black Lives Matter, it's a decentralized program. So you don't have one leader who's out here saying, this is what we speak for, this is what we represent. They did put out a manifesto quite recently, which was actually really interesting because the National Review, a very conservative website, which is we can't really disagree with a lot of things that they've said here. I also actually think them and a bit like Obama is they've actually amplified feelings of resentment that are actually there in people. They've amplified it to the point where it's now on the forefront. Their tactics, I don't agree with absolutely all of them, but again, this is what people do. I don't think a lot of people agreed with the tactics of the Springbok tour. When the Springbok tour came through, and a lot of people were saying, we can't be out here trying to put sport and politics together. People understood the point of opposing apartheid. They just didn't like the way that it was being done. And I suppose that's what's happening here is people understand what Black Lives Matter are doing. They just don't like the way that they're going about doing it. And because they don't like the way that they go about doing it, they completely disengage from the actual topics that they want to speak about. And if that's whether that's a case of respectability on Black Lives Matter or on other people is interesting. I suppose a really good video that people could watch is a podcast called General Orthodoxy by Malcolm Gladwell. Have a listen to it. It has a very, very good example of how things can get done in a better way.
See, it's interesting because I think I look at the situation and I contrast what I see a lot of coming, not all, but a lot of coming from Black Lives or in the name of Black Lives Matter, but then compare that to say, I don't want to say the cliched Martin Luther King, I've made that comparison before, but say even someone like Cornel West, who comes at these issues and really tries to, engage at that. Now, I know they're working in different spheres, but it just seems to me that, and I know the counter-argument as well, Cornel West has been doing this for years, and do people really listen to him? But when someone, has a riot and lights their own town on, which is a whole other story, why are they burning down their own neighbourhoods? I just don't get that,
I think the legacy of Martin Luther King has been whitewashed, for lack of a better word, where people love to sit there and speak about the non-violent sit-ins. People like to sit there and speak about how he has a dream, but this is a person who literally shut down an entire bridge and walked over an entire bridge and pissed off a lot of people. This is a person who came out there and said that rioting is the language of the oppressed. It's someone who championed the idea of rioting. And you're right, if you sit there and you say it so many times in terms of the way Cornel West has been saying it, in terms of the way as the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who I think has his own problems in himself, people don't sit there and understand, but when you do something problematic, people look at it. The other way that really frustrates me is, you mentioned the rioting, is the media placement of that rioting, right? People riot at the end of a sports game, and they're excused about it. People riot after winning the Super Bowl, and they're excused about it. And it's, these guys are just having fun. People riot because someone's being killed, and no one focuses on the macro level issues of that person who died. They just focus on these guys are rioting and they're looting in their own streets, and they shouldn't actually be looting in their own streets.
Well, let's talk about that then, the outside influence, the perception factor, because this is where I want to talk about the second thing was Barack Obama. I don't feel he's actually helped the situation. And I think my feeling is that, and I don't say that as someone who for a long time has found him a frustrating political leader, I just mean in situations like this, you need to be presidential. And I understand that he's got his own personal history with a lot of these issues, right? And so it's part and parcel. It's quite different when he approaches these issues. However, it just seems to me that these are moments where you really need your president, regardless of who they are, to be presidential and to actually, on the one hand, speak out strongly against, acts of violence and injustice that are happening to a community, but at the same time also say to that community, we need to respond with dignity and with our own justice, not injustice of our own against injustice. And it seems to me that at times he said that, but then at other times he hasn't really tried to calm the fire, if you like. And I sense that it's got worse. He made a speech a couple of weeks ago where it was in a media conference where he said he doesn't think America's divided. Now, I couldn't believe he said that, because I think in my lifetime, I'm 40 now, I can't remember America being this divided in my lifetime over race relations issues.
Think about O.J. Simpson.
Yeah, I mean, there's been moments, the night, the LA riot, but you think about what we have now, it just seems it's almost a weekly occurrence, and the level of tension that exists there seems just so much higher.
And this is what people from that left-hand side are going to sit there and say, is that this thing has always been happening. It's just now it's been recorded in video, right? And for Barack Obama, I kind of feel for him, because he pushed hope and change so much that people actually bought into it to the point where they forget that he's a centrist. He is fundamentally I'm not going to offend anybody, I'm a centrist. And ironically, in 2008, I think his Philadelphia speech is the biggest, most honest speech about race relations in America, where it made both sides very uncomfortable. And the vitriol he got from that, it was from black people, just he's not doing enough for black people. And then from the other side was, he's doing too much for black people. And so he's in a place where he can't win, to the point where Trayvon Martin gets killed. And he sits there and he says, hey, look, man, that's absolutely unfortunate, because, if I had a son who looked like Trayvon Martin, which is probably one of the most empathetic things that he's probably said in that situation, he was crucified for that. He was crucified for, look, you're dividing the nation. I think when he sits there and he says, we've never been more united, I suppose he comes from a point of view where he's saying, we are now actually sitting here speaking about these issues and trying to move forward and find a solution for that. I think it's a really, really tough place where he needs to be the black president as well as being the American president, and you can't sit there and show to one side or other side that you're being too much in favor of the other side. I suppose what he's done in a really, some pretty cool stuff that he's done is, in dealing with that issue, is the laws around where he's taken away penalties for people going to prison for bail, for example. In America, you can get fined for not having for a ticket, right? Not pay your ticket because you can't afford it, because you have to pay it in one lump sum and not pay in installments. And then you get caught driving, you go to prison, and you get told to pay a $2,000 bail. And look, I couldn't afford the $200 ticket. I'm now supposed to pay $2,000, or boom, you're in prison for a year and a half. So he's trying to eliminate things like that, which I think will actually move forward to it. So it's tough to sit there and have this guy supposedly be the black person's president and quell things down, but at the same time be you need to pull your socks up, because he has said that in so many occurrences and incidences, and a lot of the times people kind of hear what they want to hear.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I think partisanship now is and tribalism is so big.
Oh,
and the media spin, the way they spin the incidents, depending on what their political allegiances are, is just really problematic. I think the moment for me that was sort of the watershed was the Dallas police shootings. And we saw why it was a watershed was we saw an ex-president in George Bush, who I'm not really too interested in touting as a model president, but because I don't think he was in all areas. But his speech, contrasted with Obama's, to me, he actually felt that felt like a really presidential response, trying to calm the way, but not dismiss the injustice at the same time. And to me, that was sort of one of those moments where I thought, I don't know. And as I said, maybe I'm just reading a very selective reading of these events. But it feels to me like it's not really calming anything down.
That's part of that perception and preview that we get to have, right? And again, we're taking a step back from it. I mean, you look at people from the left, and they'll literally sit there and say, Barack Obama has actually just brought out feelings that white people or people in middle America have had towards black people for a long time. And now they can sit there and blame it on that black president for ruining things for them. And then people on the other side will literally sit there and say, he's made black people come out here and they want more and they want to do these things more. And they have no problem coming out here and saying Black Lives Matter, which, by the way, we need to speak about that slogan for as quickly as possible.
Yeah, well, let's do that then. Let's talk about that whole... I never really understood the Black Lives Matter versus All Lives versus Blue Lives Matter fight, because I understood what Black Lives Matter were doing. I think at times, though, I could understand the frustration with people on the other side, particularly the police, who were sort of saying, well, don't we matter as well, regardless of their own problems and militarisation and everything else. I worry sometimes that identity politics actually, this is a classic example of it, actually ends up dividing, even though it might be focusing on an issue, it ends up dividing us and not providing a positive way forward.
I suppose you're right when you say focusing on an issue. And I think that's what Black Lives Matter are trying to do. They're trying to sit there and focus on the state-sanctioned killing of Black lives. And I think it was really, really funny at a certain point where you had to pick a side between Black lives and blue lives. You couldn't sit there and say, well, look, obviously we're against state-sanctioned violence, but we're also against the killing of police officers. The people that really, I find hilarious are the people who say all lives matter, because for the longest time, for me anyway, it hasn't seemed like all lives matter. And if you look just on your own Facebook, right, like when bombings happened in Paris, all of a sudden we have all these Paris Facebook banners were coming up. Bombings happened in Turkey and we don't say anything. And I think I can make an argument that we have a bigger connection to Turkey than we do with France. One, we don't like France because of Rainbow Warrior, right? Two, Gallipoli. Yet here we are, no one's out there doing and caping up as much for Turkey as they are caping up for France. And I think people can sit there and literally say, well, all lives clearly don't matter, because when incidents happens on parts of the world which you don't deem to have the same value as other people, you keep quiet about it. People keep quiet about the killings in Kenya.
Even think about that recent homicide, that mass stabbing in Japan, where you got a guy who kills a whole lot of people with disabilities, and their voice has just been completely ignored. Now, if he'd done that to people who were able-bodied, I think there would have been a bigger outcry. Do you know what I mean?
If he had done it to able-bodied people in France and he had said Allahu Akbar, we'd have all known about it, right? But I suppose the hilarious thing there with the people who say Blue Lives Matter is, like, we can understand where Blue Lives Matter are coming from, and some people will use that as a way to completely dismantle the whole Black Lives Matter movement and mantra without recognizing that the only differences there are blue and black. And I can go into the facts and show you how since George Bush Sr., not George W. Bush, since George Bush Sr., the violent attacks on police officers and deaths caused in service has drastically decreased. And it's decreased the most during Obama's time. And the people can still understand how blue lives matter, but some people just can't understand why Black Lives Matter doesn't really work. And the only difference there is the word black and the word blue.
Well, and I think this is an interesting thing for me, because I think if you can say, well, and I think it's on both sides, if you can say Blue Lives Matter, then surely you can understand another group saying Black Lives Matter and hold those two in coexistence. And I think
because no one says all jobs matter.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting too, they are responding, I think, to specific threats. So you've got people in the black community who are saying, hey, here's another black guy who's been killed, right? And then you've got people in the blue industry, the blue community, the police, who are saying, here's a group of cops who have been gunned down and murdered, or here's another cop that's been killed, so they're reacting to incidents. And so I don't understand why people have to have this tension. But I think the concern is, like you say, when we try and use that to dismiss another point of view, or to say, well, they're less of a life.
Before we go, I personally don't have an issue with identity politics. I think identity politics tries to highlight situations and instances in other people. And as long as it's highlighting and focusing and not dismissing other people, I'm 100% for it, because there are some stories that you will never, ever hear unless people tell their stories, right? Like, unless I tell a story of my upbringing and my lifestyle, people who relate to me and can understand me can actually come out and be like, yeah, we agree with it. But at the same time, it's not necessarily dismissing anybody else. And if I come there and say, you can't understand, you're a white person, so shut up, that's problematic.
To me, I don't know if that's identity politics. When I think of identity politics, I think of people who divide themselves into classes. They want to treat other people as like the oppressors, like the very Marxist approach, where, I'm the victim, they're the victimizer, and then everything becomes about a grievance sort of train, and to me that's different from someone saying, here's my story. We've got to wrap it up because I know you've got to go. Just quickly then, before we do go, what's the way forward then? Because these are hot button issues in our culture. Everyone's talking about them. They're on social media and everyone gets fired up. What is the way forward? I don't mean how do you solve the problems in America or race relations in general, but what can we do in our own little sphere of influence, our own little worlds, our own little kingdoms that we operate in to perhaps progress this in a positive way?
First and foremost, as much as they're going to learn from watching your video and listening to me and talking to me, they shouldn't just take everything that we say as fact and gospel. So go out there and read more, understand more, look at both sides of the arguments, look at both sides of the spectrum, and trying to find your own place of truth. And once you understand more, talk more. And I genuinely mean talk more. Morgan Freeman's come out and said, years ago, come out and says that no one is going to solve racism from talking about racism. And I think that's absolute bollocks. I think the more you speak about it, the more you can actually understand the situations and understand where people are coming from. The funny thing about like social media, as much as it's tried to connect us to everybody, it's actually made us more entrenched in our own social political views, because we don't like someone's voice, we mute them, we unfollow them. So try to get more of that other perspective. I genuinely believe the more that we read, the more that we understand, the more that we get educated, the more we realize that people really are just people trying to do better for themselves. And like nobody's out here trying to like hurt us in actuality.
And on that note, Kelechi, thank you so much for being with us. And that's really what today was all about. And my hope is actually that you'll come back on. I'd love to have some future discussions with you on this channel, because I think it's really, really, really productive stuff. And we didn't have a chance to cover everything we wanted to. And I know there's going to be issues around this that are going to crop up in future where they're going to need two experts from different racial spectrums to actually discuss and unpack and give them the right knowledge. So I think this is there's a real potential for us going forward to perhaps model what is I think a great way forward. So thanks again, mate, for taking the time to be with us here today.
No problem. Look, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I keep watching your videos. I don't agree with all of them, but I do enjoy the perspective and the opinions as well.
Awesome. That's what it's about. Discussion, even if you disagree. Thanks, brother.
Cheers. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching this Left Foot Media discussion. I hope you enjoyed it as much as Kelechi and I enjoyed participating in it. Like I said to him at the end there, I'm going to work really hard to try and bring him back for some future discussions, because it was a really, really enjoyable experience. And like we both agreed on there at the end, it's really important that we promote these kind of rational and civil discourses between people, even if we might disagree or hold divergent views from each other on what are really pressing and hot button issues. Don't forget, if you're not already a subscriber, please become a subscriber to this channel. And if you've got other ideas for issues that we should talk about or people that I should be having discussions with, then let me know. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time on Left Foot Media.